What was the word I'm looking for now? A motion that the minutes be adjourned, please. Be deferred, please.
Mr. Chairman, I move a motion that the minutes for the last meeting be deferred.
Thank you, Minister.
You move to second that,
Is there a
sir.
seconder?
Make the second.
God bless you, sir. Thank you. Colleagues, I believe that we have with us today, as we continue the deliberations of this Joint Select Committee on the National Vending Bill, His Excellency, Mr. David Commisson, Ambassador to CARICOM, who is here to both do an oral presentation, and I would want to recognize that he has already circulated a written presentation. I trust that all the members of the committee have had an opportunity to see it, and so therefore I would want to propose that we take Ambassador Commisson first. Thereafter we will go to Mr. Sherlock King, Senior Manager of Markets, and then after that Ms. Vernell Nichols, President of Barnufo. I propose to follow the same approach that we have followed during the course of the previous meetings when persons have come before us to give evidence. And so therefore, without any further delay, I would want to welcome Ambassador Commisson. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Good morning. It would seem as though we have a little bit of a technical challenge. Okay. So he would not have heard anything that we had just said. We have to redo that then. Could you kindly indicate to me when the ambassador is in a position to hear me?
Good morning.
He can now? Okay. Colleagues, Ambassador Commisson would not have been in a position to hear me just now. I think he can now. For obvious reasons, he is located away from us for the purposes of the social and physical distancing requirements. Ambassador, I want to welcome you to this committee. The intention would be to have your oral presentation, and then the subcommittee will ask such questions or share such comments and observations as they so desire. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure exactly who the subcommittee is, exactly who I'm speaking to.
Oh, you can't see us. We can see you. I can tell you who is here so as to assist you. I have sitting to my immediate left the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, who I think would need no introduction. I have the Minister of Tourism, Senator Cummins. I have Minister of the Environment, Adrian Ford. And online, we have Dr. Lynette Holder, Senator Althea Wiggins, Minister Kirk Humphrey, and Senator Julian Hunt.
Okay, good, fine. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to be able to share some ideas with you. First of all, just to indicate that I am the Deputy Chair of the Thorne Commission on Local Governance. And one of the things I want to speak about is a particular component. As you would know, the Thorne Commission on Local Governance did a series of public consultations all across Barbados. And we have produced a report that is now with Cabinet, in which we are recommending that Barbados establish a system of people's assemblies, a kind of local government structure right across Barbados, 21 people's assemblies that will cover the entire island. And one of the functions that we are proposing for people's assemblies is a function relating to vending, vending of both goods and services, and the ability to issue licenses for the carrying on of vending in the geographical area of the People's Assembly. So it's important that this committee know about that idea. And in my presentation, I'm going to be suggesting that it is really, in light of the content of this bill, that it is really very crucial to include those people's assemblies and that local government function. However, in order to properly make my case, I need to refer to the vending situation that exists now and the fundamental change that this bill is proposing. So basically now, vending in Barbados is controlled by the Markets and Slaughterhouses Act. And the basic idea behind the Markets and Slaughterhouses Act is that there are several state-run public markets established in Barbados, and that the law seeks to protect the vendors who operate in those state-owned public markets. And so there's a zone around each of the markets, a geographical area that is demarcated, and within those geographical areas, vending is restricted, prohibited, except one has applied for and has been granted a license. But outside of those geographical zones around the public markets, vending per se is not restricted unless, of course, the activity runs afoul of any other particular law. For example, if a person is obstructing the public highway and matters of that nature, but there's no general prohibition of vending outside of the restricted zones around the public markets of Barbados. And what this new bill will be doing is changing that in a very fundamental way, in that this bill will be restricting, prohibiting vending island-wide, except one has a license, one has applied for and has been granted a license to carry out vending. And the bill says that licenses will be granted for vending within certain vending zones, and it itemizes the vending zones. Several of them are vending zones that apply to beaches and parks, etc., that will be governed by the National Conservation Commission, as obtains now. Vending zones that will consist of those geographical areas demarcated around the existing public markets. Those will be treated as vending zones. And then there's a provision that permits the National Vending Committee to establish or to recommend to the minister the establishment of other vending zones. So what we are looking at is a much more restrictive attitude towards vending. We are looking at a regulation of vending, and many of the provisions within the bill, I think in terms of treating vending as a professional or semi-professional activity and regulating it properly. But we have to be careful that we do not create a situation where we unduly restrict the opportunity of Barbadians to carry out vending activities in geographical areas of Barbados outside of the zones around the public market. So we can understand the zones around the public markets have to be looked at very carefully, because you don't want to put people who are in public markets at a disadvantage. So we understand the need for regulation around that. But the new factor that we're going to have to grapple with now is outside of those restricted zones, where you had a liberality, where you now have a liberality in terms of vending activity. Now that is going to be much more restrictive. So having said that, let me just read to you the section of the Thorne Commission report that is dealing with the People's Assemblies. And incidentally, People's Assemblies are elected by the local community. And yes, so very close. So these are bodies that are very close to the community, that will have representatives from all of the communities, all of the distinct communities within the People Assembly area. And let me go now to the particular section, issuing of licenses. And I'm quoting from the report. One of the priority functions of the People's Assembly will be to facilitate the entrepreneurial efforts of the residents of the Assembly area and to promote self-employment and the development of business enterprises. Our Commission therefore recommends that the People's Assembly should be invested with the power to issue a variety of licenses for the carrying on of small business activities in specific public spaces within the Assembly area. Such small business activities would include wayside vending, preparation and/or selling of food items, delivery of performing arts and entertainment services, delivery of taxi services, manufacture and/or sale of art and craft items, and activities of a similar type. It should therefore be the responsibility of each People's Assembly to seek out and locate public spaces within the Assembly area that are appropriate for various types of small business activities, and, having done so, to organize itself to receive applications from Assembly residents for licenses to set up operations in such areas and to issue the relevant licenses. Several members of the Commission were able to visit the recently established and developed Worthing Square food and entertainment outdoor facility at the bottom of Rendezvous Hill in Christchurch, and are convinced that People's Assemblies could play a role in establishing these types of small business development facilities in appropriate spaces all across the island. The Commission is also convinced that the establishment of facilities of this nature could intersect with the work and programs of the Community Management and Program Development Committee. That's another committee of the Joint People's Assemblies, and also could play a vital role in developing a community tourism component of Barbados's tourism industry. End of quote. So you see the idea there, okay, the idea here was that we were not going to be touching the restricted zones around the public markets. In another part of the report, we say we understand that that is the purview of the Ministry of Agriculture and the manager of markets and so forth, and we understand the logic for them wanting to have control over that area and to be the ones issuing licenses for those areas. So we said we leave that as it is, but outside of those restricted areas, that we were envisaging the people's assemblies having this role in facilitating vending activity in terms of facilitating entrepreneurial activity and helping Barbadians to establish small businesses. So if we come back now to the National Vending Bill, in the bill proposes a National Vending Committee that would have the power to recommend new vending zones. And if you look at the persons that make up that committee, representatives of various ministries, one representative of Barven, and one representative of the Association of Wayside Vendors. But it is not a committee that, like the People's Assembly, would be very close to the community. So my suggestion would be that we should try to preserve the idea that outside of those restricted areas around the public markets, that we should see that the areas outside of those restricted areas as potential areas to facilitate vending activity. And I stress again, when I say vending activity, we don't just mean the narrow wayside vendors, but small business entrepreneurial activity in relevant public spaces. And a people's assembly would be more equipped, being on the ground, having that intimate community knowledge to know what areas, what public spaces are suitable for what type of activity, what are the demands of the people in the community. So my proposal would be that we know that that in the thinking of this select committee, that you mentally reserve some space for the possibility that people's assemblies will be established in Barbados, and that if that is the case, that the role of the People's Assembly, even if it is an advisory role to the National Vending Committee, but some space be carved out for the People's Assembly to play a role in identifying spaces, public spaces within their geographical areas, and recommending to the National Vending Committee where new vending zones could be established to facilitate this entrepreneurial activity. The other point is this too, that we have to be, on my way here, for example, just to give you an example, on my way here in Darrell's Road, I passed, a private dwelling house and a young lady doing a little selling in the area just outside of her house. So we have to be conscious that, traditionally Barbadians have done things like this. Again, outside of those restricted areas around the public markets, where people have had a lot of liberality in terms of somebody maybe have lost their job, they need to earn some income. So they set up a little vending operation. Or you see occasionally, maybe it's dunk season, you see young men selling their dunks on the roadside. There's also the itinerant vendor, the snow cone vendor, the traditional itinerant vendor. You have the young ladies who go from place to place selling their grapes, for example. Or now you have the new itinerant vendor, the food vans that come around. Some of them come early in the morning. They go to different business places. So I want to flag that as well for the committee. The committee needs to think about how you're going to accommodate the different categories of itinerant vendors, how you're going to regulate them. You don't want to proscribe them, but the case of the itinerant vendor also needs to be thought about when we are looking at this bill. So those are the two things the itinerant vendor I see as a separate issue to be considered, because right now the way our law is, the law now does facilitate itinerant vendors. Even within those restricted areas, itinerant vendors are permitted. So we need to give some thought to that. And also, the major point I really want to make about the need to use the spaces outside of the restricted area around the public markets to facilitate and to accommodate vending activity, and the role that the People's Assembly can play in helping to make that work in a very positive way. So that's it, Mr. Chairman. End my presentation there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your presentation. I want to say a couple of things with respect to it. First of all, let me thank you for the observation that you closed on with respect to the itinerant vendors. It is a policy issue that clearly has to be carefully considered, because I think that your assessment of the bill is probably accurate in that there may be a need for the committee and probably subsequently Parliament to have a close relook at the way in which we have treated to the itinerant nature of the vending activity. I want to say, for the benefit of those who are listening to you and may not fully grasp some of the implications, your submissions must form part of a report which will be made to which will have to be laid in the Parliament of Barbados, and therefore will have to be debated, so that the submissions have, while having tremendous value, do not begin and end here. I think that these now go into a report which allow for us to not only reflect, but perhaps nuance some of that which we are proposing to do. I say that because I want it to be clear to everyone that the ambassador has raised a number of matters, some of which turn on constitutional issues and proposals, which are at this particular point in time just that, constitutional proposals and issues which have some constitutional implications in Barbados. An elected assembly is not, outside of the Parliament, is not part of the Constitution of Barbados, so that the People's Assemblies are things that we anticipate having the ability to see the light of day, but right now legally are not constituted. Beyond being legally constituted, then they have to be endowed with certain powers, and those powers have to be determined. Equally, they have to be then endowed with administrative capacity to do the type of work that Ambassador Commission is speaking about. And there is a challenge before the committee right now in terms of us being able to go much further with your proposals, Ambassador, because I'm sure you would understand that there's a doctrine that governs us here which does not allow for us to be anticipatory in nature. We have, unfortunately, to be constrained by those immediate circumstances, and insofar as this bill is concerned, address the immediate requirements and the historic challenges by those tools that we have immediately at our disposal. I do, however, as chairman, want to go on record as associating myself with your view that there has to be a space made mentally for the proposals which you have put before us. The implications, as I say, for us in terms of the constitutional adjustments and so on probably are going to take a little bit of time, but I do think that there is much merit in coming to a point in Barbados where these matters are dealt with in various locales across the island. If it is that we settle on 30 constituency assemblies, 30 people's assemblies based on constituencies, or however we end up doing it, I think that it is important that we have this being an instrument of local government. That's just my view. But Ambassador, I think the substance and weight of your observations are taken on board more generally. As I said at the beginning, these submissions are going to form part of the report which comes to the House. The House will have an opportunity, therefore, to debate on this, and I would wish to think that the House would see it in the broadest possible sense, which will include having a futuristic look at the options which are before us, even as we are constrained to have to settle a way forward before we actually have a substantive People's Assembly. Now, you had proposed the Thorne Commission had proposed the establishment of 21 People's Assemblies across Barbados, and I just spoke to the possibility of 30 in constituencies. And that just gives you an idea of the challenge that we're going to have to deal with intellectually on this matter, because there are going to be a variety of perspectives. I need to say also to you, Ambassador, that the matter has not yet come to Cabinet. It is supposed to be coming to Cabinet, but we have not yet seen it. And therefore, for me to dwell much further on this would be to begin a debate on a matter that has not yet really become part of government policy. But let me say to you that insofar as its implications for vending is concerned, or the implications are concerned, I am pleased that you have been able to make these submissions. I have noted the number of observations that you have made. I think there are some that we can fit into the circumstances that we have now. As I said to you, I think the most burning one is the question of how we deal with the itinerant vendors. But we will treat to this as we deal with the broader report which comes to the Parliament. At this point, I would want to open the floor to any of the members of the committee who would wish to have any questions or observations tabled. Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. You alluded in part to a challenge I have with some of the presentation, and that is with respect to the fact that the report of the Thorne Commission is to be made, whether it has arrived there yet or not, is to be made subject to Cabinet's attention and therefore Cabinet's approval of any proposals or policy postures adopted therein. Makes it very difficult, therefore, to discuss some of what the Ambassador has said in this context. And I'm bearing in mind that this meeting, I think, is being broadcast. And therefore, we can't be, in my view, anticipating what the Cabinet would do, assuming Cabinet has taken certain. I think you were indicating that. I'm with you on that, so it creates a little bit of difficulty. I was interested also in what Ambassador said. The bill as it stands creates a more restrictive, implies a more restrictive attitude towards vending. if that is the ambassador's assessment on looking at the bill, analyzing the provisions, then we have a challenge, because my understanding is the intention of the legislation is to democratize the whole business of vending in Barbados, put it on a more solid footing, and attach a certain level of commercial professionalism to what is very much a part of Barbadian culture, and the bedrock of that which supports many Barbadian families. If the ambassador's assessment is that the bill suggests a more restrictive attitude, then I think I will want to ask him to elaborate a bit on that, maybe a little bit more specificity. And it suggests, if he's correct, then we have to do some retreading of the wheel. I support him on the issue of the itinerant vendor. When we had a debate in Parliament, and you, sir, allowed me to speak, I did make reference to that. I think it's very important. It's a traditional thing in Barbados. It's becoming more commonplace, and we're now seeing it being associated with a wider variety of activities, as Ambassador Commission has suggested. But I'd like to hear him a little bit more on his view that this bill implies a more restrictive attitude towards vending.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to respond to that. Well, if you look at the bill, for example, Section 3 says, for the purposes of this act, vending refers to the offering for sale of merchandise or the rendering of services in a vending zone for the purpose of earning a living or for the duration of a fair, farmers market, festival, etc. That's Section 3. And then Section 4 says, no person shall operate as a vendor pursuant to Section 3 unless he is 16 and he has a license to do so. So basically what this bill says is that henceforth, to operate as a vendor in any part of the island, one must apply for and be granted a license. But the way the law is at present, that approach is really restricted to the zones, the geographical zones around the public markets. So the law that we have in place now under the Markets and Slaughterhouses Act is basically designed to restrict and prohibit and restrict vending in a geographical area around the public market. And obviously the thinking would have to be that you're trying to protect people who are in the public market, and you're trying to control any undue competition that they have. But away from those zones, those restricted areas, vending is permitted unless the person, as I said, runs afoul of some other law, unless they unduly block the highway or that kind of thing. So this bill is proposing to regulate vending right across the island. So to that extent, it is promoting a more restrictive approach. And with that restriction comes regulations, and I guess a lot of the regulations are good because you're pushing the vendor towards a more professional type of operation. But so my point is, I fully understand that the Thorne Commission is just a report at this point. It is not part of the law of Barbados. It still has to be looked at by the cabinet. But I thought it would be wrong not to draw to the attention of this committee that one small component of the report that deals with issuing of vendors' licenses, because I just think you need to be aware of it. I know that you can't, in a sense, take it on board now because it's still only a proposal that cabinet has not even looked at yet. But I just thought that in terms of your own mental processes, you need to be aware that that is something that is being proposed. But it does not, even aside from the people's assemblies, the fundamental point is that if you are going to have this more restrictive and regulatory approach to vending right across the entire island, in my opinion, if we are going to hold on to that notion that we want to facilitate new small business entrepreneurial activity, and I mean, you go to that Worthing Square and you see the benefit in being able to have public spaces like that and being able to give small entrepreneurs a license to come together and operate in a public space like that, and really to establish a very flourishing entrepreneurial zone. That if you're going to hold on to that concept that this can be replicated across the island, then you're going to need some community-based entities that could interact with the National Vending Committee and could steer them in that direction towards being facilitatory of vending activity, rather than simply being regulatory and restrictive. And also, you need those community structures because, as I said, you also want to be able to accommodate the average Barbadian, the average person who, for them, vending might be a short-term emergency measure to deal with a loss of employment. And so you want community-based structures that could facilitate the interests of such a person. And the National Vending Committee, as it is comprised now, I mean, obviously it has all of the relevant ministries represented, it has all of the relevant expertise, but it is not a structure that will have that intimate rapport with an insight into the communities all across Barbados. So if it is not the People's Assembly, I think there needs to be some other entity to play the role that we envisaged the People's Assembly playing, and feeding that advice into the National Vending Committee.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, do you have any other?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hear Ambassador Kamashong on both issues. The procedural matter of us debating with any greater specificity proposals in the report that Cabinet itself has not yet looked on. And I understand where he's coming from. I appreciate that it was necessary to alert us. It's just that the circumstances of this committee create a situation where we're going out to the public with matters which are occupying the attention of the Cabinet, upon which Cabinet has not yet decided. That's just the challenge, but I am beyond that. The Commission seemed to be concerned with reference to sections 3 and 4, the business of regulating that which is not now regulated, and therefore sees this from the perspective that it perhaps makes things a bit more restrictive. The other side has been taken, I think, largely by the views represented in the committee thus far, and that is what you're looking to do by regulation to that which is not now regulated is to bring a bit of formalization to the process, is to improve standards, and to ensure that we have the kind of vending environment operating in Barbados that lifts the status, position of vendors now, and also ensures that the service meted out to those who are customers and clientele is of the kind of quality that is desirable. So I think it's, looking at the same issue from the two sides, and I can see where one might think the implication here is for a more restrictive situation, I think I see the other side, though, that the regulation, though it is new, will bring a greater commercial professionalism, formalization of the process, ensuring better standards at what we now do as simply perhaps coming out of our cultural impulse.
Thank you. Ambassador, I want to give you the assurance as chair, and obviously as minister, and I am very mindful of the fact that even as the future will portend that this matter will eventually attract the attention of the cabinet, and that as we go forward, it will attract the attention of the Parliament with respect to the constitutional implications of the Thorne Commission's report. I also have to be mindful of the fact that I will not always be minister responsible for this sector. And so therefore, there has to be some certainty. I say that in all seriousness. It can't vary with the appetite of the minister or the size of his shoe. So therefore, there are some truisms that I want to take on board right now as we are at this stage. I think you're 100% right, and I agree with you totally and completely. The creation of vending zones, I've said before in this chair, during the course of the last week of taking evidence and having this kind of interface with other people, including members of the vending community, my perspective is that the creation of the vending zones must be broad and they must be purposive, as broad as we can possibly make them, so that they're not restricted by the context that you quite rightly point us to today, but that they transcend that and they go island-wide, and that at the same time we recognize that we have benefited in Barbados from an excellent couple of examples. You pointed us to Worthing Square, which is completely organic. Equally, Oistins has been completely organic. And these are examples. There are others to be found from place to place, which I think we must continue to be able to facilitate. Equally, there have been planned activities for the purpose of vending, like the nighttime vending that was introduced when I was Minister of Tourism. And that is something that I believe the Ministry of Tourism is right now also looking at in terms of not just nighttime activities being reinstituted in Barbados, insofar as vending is concerned, but other areas of the island being utilized for the purposes of capturing the commercial opportunity to be extended to vendors at locations across Barbados, so as to merge the touristic dollar spend with the commercial impulse of the people. So I take that on board, and I share with you your concern in that regard. I think that what I would want to hear from you is just an idea or two on the question of the way in which we might be able to, at this point, without actually having the People's Assemblies legally constituted in Barbados as yet, the way in which we might be able to benefit from the input of the communities in this country with respect to the settling of the vending zones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to touch on Bishop Adderley's final point, yes, it is really a balancing act between the two. Yes, I think what this bill does, by better regulation and insistence on standards, it is actually lifting the overall standard of this small business activity. But in so doing, it is prescribing and potentially prescribing and regulating right across the island in a way that has not happened before. And so the committee just needs to be mindful, how do you get the right balance? And my suggestion is that perhaps the only way that you can get that right balance is if you have entities whose mandate it is to be very conscious of and knowledgeable about the community and the people in the community, and is there to propose reasonable and sensible ways to facilitate this kind of activity in the communities, particularly in the communities that are away from those zones around the public markets that you have always wanted to be very careful about and very restrictive about. And so this is where the People's Assembly would be the perfect kind of community-based institution to have an interactive role with the National Vending Committee to advise them, and so Mr. Chairman is asking me, since the People's Assembly is maybe is a possibility and is certainly futuristic, on what in the interim, right, what could play that same role. And I'm afraid, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I have an answer. I'm not sure I have an answer. I guess between the Community Development Department, the youth commissioners, and so forth, I guess you could cobble together some kind of entity that is now to be found within relevant departments of government, that have a mandate for the community. So I guess you could pull together some interagency governmental communities that are very close to the community, that could play that kind of connecting role, because that's what you're talking about.
Correct.
Somebody to play a connecting role between the community and the people in the community and that central national vending committee, so that the National Vending Committee could benefit from the proactive advice and input. So yes, that would be, that's off the top of my head, that would be the recommendation that I would make.
Fine, and I want to thank you for that. It is easy in these matters sometimes to be overly cheerful and optimistic and sanguine about some of these types of issues. But as I said, you, Ambassador, are not going to be with us in perpetuity, and I certainly am not going to be minister in perpetuity. And therefore, there is a need for us to be able to ensure that the necessary structures are put in place that will ensure the continuity and sustainability of this effort. And I need not school you. You know very well how this particular category of persons in our society have had to struggle through the, not just decades, through the centuries, in order to come to this particular moment. I want to recognize Minister Humphrey.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you as well, Ambassador. It is always, in my opinion, very refreshing to listen to you, Ambassador. I feel as if I learn something every time. And I take note of our concern in relation to People's Assembly and the fact that they're not yet properly established. But I hope as a committee, even though we cannot focus on the structure of it, that we do not lose the sense of what is being said. And the sense of it, in my opinion, and having had the privilege of chairing and leading the constituency councils with all their flaws, I see the benefit of what is being proposed. And so even though we may not be able to focus on the structure, I think the sense of it is really germane, and I do not wish for us to lose it in terms of its intention and its aspiration. And so the question remains, if there is a gap in relation to the current structure of the committee, that the People's Assemblies, when properly formed, and so we can't focus on it, but that the people's assemblies could possibly service or fill, then what are we missing must be the question. And I reflect on that because there was a time when, again, when we were doing the councils, I felt as if civil society organizations, particularly community-based organizations, Chair, should have much more of a role in relation to the activities that are being done within various communities, constituencies, that community-based organizations that are really the pulse of the people should be much more involved in terms of the governance processes. And I suspect here that this could be a place for such community-based organizations, like Pinelands in the Pine, Israel Level in the Ivy, various ones across Barbados. The tragedy, and I think one that we cannot overlook, is that when we were setting up those councils and we reached out to a number of those community-based organizations, sadly, most of them only existed on paper. And when we were asking for representation to serve on the councils, there was an absence of genuine representation because in many cases, many were formed again around a single person, usually a very charismatic person, but a single person. And in some cases, when that person either left, died, or somehow was no longer involved, while the body remained in name, they weren't really there. But the role that they could play should not be, we should not reduce it, because I think that's a really good point made by the ambassador. When I look at the structure, and I've looked at it before, but when I looked at it, having listened to the ambassador, there is really a role for that genuine community-based organization to determine where, is the most appropriate area within communities to be able to do that. And I had written a paper a few years ago in which I asked and attempted to answer the question, can the state play a role in building social capital? And if so, what would be that role? And I think as we go forward, when we get there, that is a question that perhaps the people's assemblies could help us answer. But until such time, what can we do to help strengthen those same community-based organizations, whether geographic community, whether their constituency is a demographic base, but that to have their involvement, I think, genuinely makes a lot of sense. And but I do know we also have the liberty of being able to adjust or to have maybe subcommittees of the committee that would allow us to be adequately and appropriately informed by the persons who control the local knowledge. And so I wouldn't want to miss that. And then the second point that was raised in relation to the itinerant vendor, because I was listening very carefully. The second point that was raised, I also reflected upon it, and Newton's third law of motion came to mind, which is that for every action, there is always an equal and opposite reaction. And while it is our intention to genuinely offer something to the vendors that they currently do not have, in so doing, based on the statements, then obviously there are some things that may be curtailed. But that we believe that in terms of what we are offering, the facilities that they would have, the organization, the access to training and so on, that what we're offering is significant. And that's the way it goes. Every society that becomes more disciplined, more organized, even community bodies, to be honest with you, and I've been on several, as you become more organized, there is a certain freedom associated with being able to do what you like that is lost, but in the interest of being able to do it better. And I suspect that that is what is happening here. So I take that point too, but I genuinely believe that what we are offering perhaps would allow us to be able to service that community more adequately. Thanks for listening to me, Chair.
And thank you for your observations. Are there any other requests for the floor? Minister Cummins.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to join my colleagues and you, Mr. Chairman, in acknowledging the important role that has been played by Ambassador Commission and his comments and the timeliness of those comments. But I want to tap into his experience at the CARICOM level and his role at the CARICOM level to ask a question perhaps which is consistent with what we have been discussing in this committee about the important developmental companion to this regulatory framework that we are here developing. Ambassador, I wanted to get a sense from you, given your insights, your experience, and your exposure, if there is a prospect for us using the regulatory framework that we are developing here, along with the national developmental frameworks that we have been discussing in the context of this committee, to treat vending across the region as part of our development trajectory. And by that I mean, we spoke in earlier sessions of the committee, Ambassador, about things like taking vendors from the initial entry level of vending to become wholesalers, distributors, importers. And we also spoke about the importance of moving them from the introductory role of vending into becoming business people who have a role to play at an economic and a commercial level, and who can themselves form a part of an established wealth creation that is generational and intergenerational. And I just wanted to get a sense from you whether or not, in your role as ambassador to CARICOM, and as you engage with countries across the region, there is potential for that kind of elevation and that kind of coherence in regional policy as well. In the same way, Ambassador, that we have regional associations of manufacturers, regional chambers of commerce, we now have the Caribbean, the Regional Private Sector Association. Would you see there being the prospect for a regional approach to vending as well?
Thank you for that question. Yes, in fact, I would applaud the intent behind this piece of legislation to lift up the activity and to give it professional standards. You know, I always tell people about, well, first of all, let me say that, because everybody may not know, but I've been involved with vendors and vending activity from way back in the mid-1980s. I was the legal advisor to the Wayside Vendors Business Association for 8 years. In fact, I helped to establish that association, and I've worked very closely with Barven as well. So I have, and back then, our activism was all around trying to get public officials and other private sector entities to simply understand that vendors are legitimate business persons too. Just like the store owner, just like the hotel operator, that vendors, wayside vendors, are business people, and that as a public official, for example, you can't just, you have to treat them with the respect that is due to a person involved in serious business activity. You can't just wake up one morning and tell them you have to move from here without consulting, without giving them any proper notice that you would give to a proper business person that you respect. And that was our campaign, I mean, for many, many years, just to get that respect and that understanding. And there are many sections within this bill that suggest that that respect and understanding has finally come. I can also tell you that because of my experience with the vendors, I have seen vendors who have developed from being just the normal wayside vendor with a little tray to becoming shop owners, to elevating their enterprise, and to becoming very substantial retailers in their own right. And I must tell you that I have a lot of hopes for the new Barven market on Spring Garden Highway. I know what are the plans and what are the intentions behind that operation. That the intention is to take it in that direction of expansion, development, professionalism. and so forth. And I often tell this story about, many years ago, going to New Jersey in the United States, and visiting a shoemaker shop in New Jersey, and just being blown away, because my experience of a shoemaker shop in Barbados was a little hole in the wall place, usually unkempt, and let me just say, a little hole in the wall place, and going to a shoemaker shop in New Jersey and seeing, a full professional operation, and seeing the shoemaker, operating like a professional and earning revenue at the level of a real professional. So to answer your question, yes, I think that this is what we should be aiming for: the elevation of vendors, the inculcation of standards, training and certification if need be. And yes, the CARICOM arrangements, the right of establishment program. First of all, to develop the vendor with all of the professional standards and the business standards and practices would fit right into the right of establishment program, because now you're talking about a small business and a small business person that would have the right to range beyond Barbados and to establish itself in other participating CARICOM member states. So this is exactly the direction that we really need to be going in, and taking people start at the most basic level of just the normal hawker or vendor with a small tray, but seeing that person can be elevated, and with proper training and proper standards, and could even be elevated to the point where they are a business enterprise that could range, could set their tentacles, could move right across the region. So yes, Senator Cummings, I think we are on the right track with that kind of thinking.
Well, Ambassador, I thank you, and clearly you have impacted, resonated with Senator Cummings, because she is blushing beneath her mask. I open the floor now to Minister Ford.
Thank you, Ambassador, and good morning. Welcome to the discussion. I want to locate my discussion this morning and a question that was asked about the word vending. And I want to say that we have now moved it, as you said, to a different standard. In the markets, they call it the phytosanitary standard. You've heard it mentioned about the level of training associated with vending. There's the National Training Initiative, there's the Youth Entrepreneurship Scheme. There are programs within the ministries across sectors that invite training so that persons can bring their products to world-class level. And I know that the question is often asked about the use of the word vending, because we are talking about the new vending bill, and that's what we are debating now. There are a number of words that could be associated with vending. I just want your take on it, because that question was asked to the head of Barvin, and he said that he's very comfortable in his skin with the word vending being still used by those who would have been involved in the trade of goods or services. And there were some other words that were being bandied around. For instance, the husking and hustlering, and there was the school of thought at one time that the word hawking would be associated with vending. The word vendition, there was association with, for instance, pitching was a word I heard bandied around the place. I want to know from you, a person who would be intimate and associated with this whole discussion, What is your take on the word vending having an umbilical association with this whole act and this bill going forward? And what do you think about the word and its association with what we are doing as a country going forward?
Thank you.
And perhaps before you answer, Ambassador, just let me lend a little context, because it had been interestingly raised in this committee that we should give thought to reconsidering the use of the term vending. That had become a little bit of a source of debate. So I just want to lend that context to it. Floor is yours.
Thank you. No, I did read the comment by Brother Alistair Alexander in the newspaper, and I'm with him. I understand where he's coming from, because in the vending community, certainly among the more conscious members of the vending community, there is a knowledge that vending, wayside vending, was one of the early forms of resistance by oppressed black Barbadians to the whole, white supremacy system in Barbados. And, you go back, you look at the various slave acts where the slave owners, the plantocracy, saw this activity and these people as a threat. It was a form of resistance, and it was an activity through which oppressed black Barbadians not only defied that plantocracy system, but through which they were pushing the boundaries in trying to create space for themselves, economic space, cultural space. And when we came together in the 1980s to organize vending associations and to fight for the rights of vendors, I think we took great pride in the fact that we were representing a historical tradition of black resistance and struggle in Barbados. And so I think quite rightly there is a pride in how far wayside vendors have come. There's a pride in the battles that were fought, and there's a pride in the breakthroughs that we are seeing now. And so I understand where the president of Barven was coming from. He was reflecting a pride in all of that history. And so, and for him, the word vending is so connected to that historical record, to that history of struggle, that even if people wanted to give it negative connotations in the past, the community of vendors have appropriated it and have given it a very positive content and meaning. And I'm not even sure if it's a word that is used right across the Caribbean, but even if it is unique to Barbados, then it is a Barbadianism. It is a component of Barbadian tradition that we should have no qualms about holding on to and lifting up and using. So I'm with Brother Alexander.
Thank you. I am not seeing any other requests for the floor at this stage. I would want to say to you, Ambassador, that once again I want to thank you very much for your time and the substance of your contribution. Let me say to you that whilst you were speaking and interfacing with others, the Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel and I have been looking at a way in which we can properly incorporate into the bill the point that you had made with respect to itinerant vending. I'm happy to say that I think we've made some satisfactory progress in that regard. There's still one or two issues, obviously, that we would have to work through. The Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel is not a magician, but she's highly competent. So that this does seem to be an oversight that we can correct. And I am again in your debt, sir, for the assistance that you have offered. I can only say to you that as chair and as minister, the observations that you have made have resonated with me. I think there's absolutely no difficulty whatsoever in maintaining that mental space for us to treat to this issue at a community level when once we have the legal wherewithal to do so. But in the interim, we'll do everything that we can in order to capture the spirit of your submissions and to give life and meaning to them. So thank you, sir. Committee, I'm going to invite a motion now that we briefly suspend proceedings so that the place where the next witness is online. Okay, Ambassador, there's no issue for us. We don't have to suspend because our next witness is Mr. Sherlock King, and he is the supervisor. Was it supervisor of markets? Manager of markets, and he is online. So what I would do is just thank you, sir, for your attendance, and we will just give our attention now to Mr. King.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It was a pleasure engaging with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. King. Are you able to hear us?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Morning.
And the other members of the committee.
Morning and welcome. Mr. King, I want to thank you for making yourself available. I believe you would have had an opportunity to follow much of what transpired earlier this morning. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, fine. Now, perhaps what I should begin by saying to you is that, as I said to Ambassador Commission, as Minister, well, in fact, before I go there, perhaps I should accord you the same treatment as everybody else has been given. Do you, first of all, wish to make any opening statement or any opening comments about this legislation before we start to question you?
Just briefly, respect to the bill, some of the things that stood out to me basically is trying to have a structure towards vending in Barbados. As the ambassador made clear, the Market and Slaughterhouses Act prescribes vending within a prohibited area. For example, in Bridgetown, as you will be aware, to sell or to be able to vend in Bridgetown, you will require a permit, which is issued by the Ministry of Agriculture. Outside of those prescribed areas, vending is, as he's indicated, it is a liberality. It is unregulated, and persons are permitted to vend free. This vending bill attempts to bring vending out of some respects of the informal sector into a formal sector where that some measure of regulation, some measure of control. I took the point where he said that the vending bill it could be restrictive because there is an age. There's an age element to it. Previously, usually you see young boys also during the vacation who would be under the age of 16 selling whatever fruits that might be in season, keys, don'ts, cigarettes, or whatever. But this bill would now encapsulate those persons, and I might be wrong, but that type of activity may, for those persons under the age of 16 now, there will be some controls there. Okay. Now, again, you're looking at moving and regulating the sector because as the entire committee may be also aware that there are some challenges that we have with persons who are widely selling and so on the highways. And there is a hygiene aspect of it, which is a very, very serious concern of mine. If you're having persons selling commodities that persons are to eat, and without having any sort of kill step, or when I mean a kill step, there's no cooking involved to destroy any microorganisms. That you have this unregulated activity taking place on the highways and so on, and there are no sanitary facilities available to those persons. So there's some challenges that we see, and that this bill is attempting to address, and where possible, looking at creating vending zones where the state can provide refuse collection facilities, sanitary facilities, basic items such as water and so on. So I think that in this regard, moving, to look at it from a national point of view, to bring those persons from the informal sector to the formal sector, and that there are opportunities there. There will be opportunities there for improvement. There will be opportunities there for further advancement of the vendors and so on. Okay, now, as you would know, Minister, we would have had some discussions with respect to, before we got to this stage, with respect to enforcement and whether or not an administrative penalty would be enough of a deterrent in trying to enforce the rules and the regulations outside of the traditional vending zones in Bristol. As you may know, we had some discussion regarding the enforcement aspect. If a person does not pay the fine, what next? And yes, you can increase the fine and so on, but what is the sanction, and how does you prevent? How do you try to enforce this aspect if a person is operating without a permit or without operating without a license? So that is one of the areas that I think we need to have a look at. In addition to that, as you would be also aware, the issue of enforcement at a national level, because you're going to increasing the areas of operation. So as they said, we would have indicated that there's some period of time before the passing and before the proclamation where that we would probably just try to handle these aspects, these administrative aspects and so on. So that said, I will leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Mr. King, I want early in this exercise to give you an opportunity to clear the air on a concern that has been raised with us. Do you have a market at Palmetto Square?
There is a Palmetto Mall public market, and that is at the head of at the top of Swan Street.
I didn't hear the last part. There is a
There's
Palmetto.
a Palmetto Mall and market.
Right.
This market is at the top of Swan Street, where you can walk straight through from Swan Street and go straight through to Mahill Street.
Okay, fine. And in that market, are there stalls rented to persons who are vending or kiosk
course.
spaces? Huh?
Yes, there are vendors there, and there are persons who operate different type of business activities in that market itself.
Okay. And do you have a structure for the rentals? Is there a fee for the rentals there?
Yes, there are rental fees, and the rental fees will vary based on the size of the operation.
Now, would it be possible, in your view, for a person to rent a place, a space at the Palmetto Market and then sublet that space to somebody else?
That issue does not occur at Palmetto Market. Most or all the vendors who rent space they operate their own business activity there. So we don't have a case where that, for argument's sake, John Smith, who rents a space, and then Adam Ladd sells in that space for him to sublet. All the vendors that I'm aware of at Palmetto Market, they sell themselves, they operate their own business themselves. I am not certain. I hear you mention the term Palmetto Square. I'm hoping that we are not mixing up an area on the street itself as opposed to a public market. So Palmetto Square, is this the area just outside of the rear entrance of Parliament?
No, I got the impression that we were being pointed to the direction of the market itself.
No, there's no subletting of space at Palmetto Market.
Mr. King, the request is that you turn on your camera, please. The officials in Parliament need to be able to see you. Thank you, sir. Bear with me 1 second. The question is, though, that whether it is possible in your view and in your experience, has it ever been a case that you are aware of, for there to be a market under your supervision in which rent is being paid pursuant to the legal requirement of the tenant, but then the tenant sublets to somebody else? Are you there?
That is an occurrence that has taken place in the past, and I think it.
I'm sorry, Mr. King. I think the internet is being unkind to you at a terrible point in time. You could please repeat that which you were saying.
We have had instances in the past where at some markets persons have been subletting stalls. Okay, this is a occurrence that we observed that has happened at Fairchild Street, and we are now drafting some tenancy agreements to put an end to that. And it happens predominantly among those persons who might be non-nationals, who may be looking to sell or a source of income, and an unscrupulous individual may sublet to somebody non-national. That this is something we are seeing at Fairchild Street, but I'm not aware of it taking place at Palmetto Square. I've had a discussion with the supervisor there up to this morning because the issue was raised, and no, we have not. I've never had an issue of subletting at Palmetto Market, nor at Marhill Street Market. It just does not happen there.
Okay, I don't want to be geographically specific, but the point is that you are aware that it has happened in the past. Are there any rules that now exist with respect to the management of matters of this nature, regulation of matters of this nature in the market?
Yes, there is a section in the Market and Houses Act which indicates that if a person sublets, that person can lose their tenancy with immediate effect. And the person who is subletting, the manager of markets or the chief supervisor, has the power to at least turn over the tenancy to the person who's doing the subletting.
No.
But the challenge that we have in some instances is that what we observe is that a person may make a report that they're being charged for X or Y, so on, but there's no transactional document taking place. So it is a case where that the tenant themselves say that this person works for me, whatever. But sometimes the difficulty is trying to get the evidence that the person actually is being paid those sums to the tenant, and then once you have that tangible, that physical evidence, then you can act.
I see. But it would appear to me that if somebody is working for me, there are some requirements that I'm going to have to follow in law. I would have to be able to establish that I am paying them whatever the salary is. Do you all, in the process of investigating these matters, take these things into consideration?
Not right now, because most of the transactions that with the vendors and so on are basically word of mouth transactions. There are no written contracts, there are no written documentation and so on by the vendor. So they bring on these persons as helping hands and so on, and so they just basically word of mouth transaction.
And so therefore, the creation in this bill of a set of requirements where you will therefore have now let me just get the legislation. If I go to the legislation, I am seeing formal application forms for the permits, and then further into the schedule, there are provisions which are made for a number of different types of notices. And again, as we go through the schedule, you have obviously the provisions made for the administrative penalties and so on. Are you satisfied that the provisions which are now appearing in this legislation and are proposed in this legislation are satisfactory to cure the mischief that you're pointing us to?
Not necessarily, because you're gonna always have that informal transaction with tenant, because again, a tenant, he would apply for a license, or an individual would apply for a license, but there's no provisions in this new bill which says to that individual that any person that he employs should also apply for a license. Should also apply for a license. It only speaks to the person who is tenanted to the market itself, but in terms of that person employing some person,
I would imagine that the requirement in those cases would not be for a license for that person I employ, but proof of the employment that I should be able to produce to you. I have the license. So if I have the license, I have to be able to produce it to you. And I'm raising this issue because I want to take you, sir, out of the glare of public disapproval. And I'm being very frank with you. The suggestion would be that people in the market enter into a contract with the government in order to have the space available. And the evidence before this committee is that there have been instances where persons unscrupulously decide that they're going to sublet their space for far more money than that which they're paying the government. No, that cannot happen without it having implications for the person who is manager of the markets. So it is important for you as manager of markets to be able to satisfy, I would hope, first of all, yourself, and then the rest of us, that everything that can be done is in fact being done to prevent these things from happening. And it is now for you, sir, to be able to point this committee to the things that you would like us to be able to do to make sure that this legislation, going as it is towards building a new future and a new range of opportunities for vendors, also protects the public interest at the same time. You agree?
I agree, and Minister, I would wish to also inform this committee that we have taken action um, in the past. We have taken action at present, and we will also take action in the future. We have met with a number of those vendors who we have reasonable suspicion that they've been subletting, and informed them, and we've actually revoked the tenancy for a number of those persons. So it is something that we do on a continuous basis, but what we try to do is to do all due diligence and to cover all our bases so that we would not in any way be adversely affecting persons in terms of earning a livelihood. In terms of the bill, Minister, there are some aspects of it. I can't speak to the specific area, but I would most likely, going back to it, would submit those as part of some written comments from our end.
So, would you agree with me then that it would be helpful to you if you had a provision in this bill for there to be some prohibition against subletting of stalls?
Ministry, we have developed a tenancy agreement which all tenants are to sign. Okay, and inside the tenancy agreements, specifically references that the
and you're satisfied that that will satisfactorily police the matter.
Right. This is what we are also doing. That we are advising that the stores within the market system be owner operated. In this sense, that if you are a food vendor, you have a food stall in the market, you are to operate the food stall yourself. So there are some new provisions that we are putting in the tenancy agreement, which would make it much more difficult for those persons to sublet.
May I suggest to you, though, that you may need to go further, because it is all well and good to say that I am a fruit vendor and I should be operating the fruit stall myself. The truth of the matter is that I am like you. We are human beings and we can get sick. If I take ill, but I have a sister who is able to help me keep the household together, and she at the time is unemployed, what are your views on how that is handled? Am I able to assign my stall, or if I could procure a license for her?
We've made provisions for that, Minister.
You have? Okay.
Yes, once the person you would approach us, and this is something that is ongoing all the time. We've had individuals who may have had to go for operations. They may be out of commission for some period of time, and they have asked us if their sister or their husband or their son or their daughter can operate for them during that period of time. This is something that we are aware of, and that has happened, and there's provisions in the tenancy agreement for such an event.
Okay. Are there any other members of the committee who wish to take the floor? Minister Ford.
Thank you, Mr. King. My discourse this morning will run tangential to that which you and the chairman just had. And it's basically to say it's a continuation of the debate. I understand you perfectly where you're saying that the evidence, to collect the evidence for subletting may be a difficult task and difficult exercise, where you have to ensure that there is proof to suggest that a person is subletting. I understand that perfectly. But I want to go a little further. Whether it's subletting or any other infraction, maybe an infraction medically too. But when there is an infraction, what is the procedure that is taken to ensure whether it be for the lack of payment of rental fees, it may be something that, it may be a disgrace with a vendor, maybe a condition where he has not acceded to the phytosanitary standards or the health standards as expected in the markets. It may be a plethora of reasons. My question is to you is, oftentimes you hear that vendors are owing the markets and the ministry lots of money, sometimes going into the thousands of dollars. It is not dissimilar to what I experienced as minister with responsibility for the NCC. What is your procedure for evicting? And if you turn to page 20, it should be 25 or maybe 26 on your computer.
Minister, if I could ask you just to pause, just hold your thought. We're getting a lot of feedback. That there's a technical challenge. I think that's been corrected now. Please proceed.
Mr. King, I hope that you heard my early submission.
Yes, I did.
Oh, right. I want to ask you, at page 25, and maybe 26 on your computer, under part 4 of the proposed legislation, relocation and eviction of vendors, what is the procedure for you in the markets in terms of evicting a vendor who has not acquiesced to the standards as expected? What is your procedure? Because we are making at 19.1, we are suggesting that we give them a 30 days notice to remove their items and to give up the space if they have come ran contrary to what is the normal expectations. So I want to know what is the procedure, the step procedure that is taken by your department when you have to evict a vendor.
All right, thanks for the question, Minister. The procedure that we follow, we would issue a rent reminder to the individual, giving them 30 days to sort out their rents. Okay. Now, if within the 30 days they have not sorted out the issue with their rent, we give them a further 2 weeks to clear the arrears. If those arrears have not yet been cleared, we give them a third notice, which is basically 1 week to clear their arrears. Okay. Now, after that has exhausted, the supervisor or the person in charge of the market would write to the ministry requesting that we terminate the tenancy of that individual. And for the purposes of transparency and so on, we would write to the PS and getting to the permanent secretary that we are going to terminate this person's tenancy because of these particular infractions. So once that is done, we would then put a lock onto the booth, and then instruct or inform the persons that the legislation gives the market and so the supervisor the permission to sell or to dispose of the items within the shop to recover the rent. So, but basically, that is how our procedure goes. And if it may be a case where there's a genuine concern on the part of a genuine issue, we try to go into what we call a payment plan, where that we try to keep the persons current, they pay towards the current, and then what they do, they try to bring down their rents over a period of time. So we don't try to throw out persons because everybody's situation will be different. But what we try to do is after you exhausted those avenues, we try to get the person within a payment plan and to try to bring down the rent however much they can. So for argument, if their rent is $50 a month, we will continue to take the $50 a month to keep the rent current. And if they owe $1,000, we will say, okay, join, at least bring in another $50 or another $100 so that within 10 months or so they will clear off the arrears. So we try to be as humane as possible and try to give as much notice, and then at the same time, you also ask them to go into a payment plan where they pay, they put money towards the current, and they also clear the arrears over time.
I want to follow up. Is government's unapologetic intent to decriminalize vending? I want to ask you, in the event that a vendor refuses to pay that which you have instructed him to, when you have done all your calculations, and I recognize, of course, that he is in the thousands of dollars in arrears. What is the procedure for you to get reclaim that money, since we are not going the criminal route? What is your intention, or what is the normal procedure for the government to get back the money that is owed?
In some instances, we would apply to a magistrate's court to enforce the order.
But that can't happen anymore. So there would have to be a debt owed by that person, which is recoverable in civil proceedings. Deputy Chief Parliamentary Counsel?
Chair, what the manager of markets is referring to is what is already provided for in the law, and the Debtors Act, and it's also incorporated in other mechanisms. And you would also note that with the administrative penalties, those are also treated as a debt to the Crown, which you can recover in the magistrate's court. So it is not something that is foreign at all.
But civil proceedings as opposed to criminal?
Civil proceedings as
Fine.
opposed to criminal.
I wouldn't want it to go out there that there's no sanction. The sanction would be a civil process as opposed to a criminal process. Minister Ford, thank you. May I ask Mr. King, well, not may I ask, let me just start by saying it is the intention that this piece of legislation, once it is passed, is going to come into operation by announcing the date of its taking effect. Right? So a proclamation will be made to say that the legislation takes effect, for example, from the 1st of January 2022, just to pull a date out of the air. There are some provisions in here which are designed to make sure that we now create a level playing field between the vending community and the state, the administrators of the law in Barbados. One of those things has to be that we are creating vending zones, and as a person who will be a manager of the vending zones, I now have to ask you a couple of questions about how you see things working, because there will be some instances, for example, where there may be a requirement for you to seize produce. And that could happen if there is a challenge with respect to eviction from a particular vending zone. And after the 30-day notice for the eviction has passed and the person does not respond in the way they're expected to respond, then you would have a right in law after that 30-day notice has passed to then issue your seizure notice of what it is that you are seizing. Now let's assume that you are seizing perishables, which may be things like fruits and so on that could spoil. I am questioning whether there is, in your judgment right now, adequate freezer capacity that you have access to. Because what we have to be able to do is to help the wider government now plan out those things that have to be put in place so as to give life to this legislation on a day-by-day basis. Are you with me?
Yes, I'm with you.
Right. So, say for example, freezer capacity. Right now, what kind of freezer capacity do you have? If you had to say to seize perishables and store them for a period of time.
We don't really have that large capacity to store perishables, because that is, as you rightly mentioned, these are things that we have to build out now, because we will have to separate items that we seize in this aspect away from the normal day-to-day stores that we have for the vendors within the public market system. We want to have that separated. That is a discussion and that we will have to have, and that we will have to have a separate facility so that we can effect the seizure of these commodities and to preserve them in a fashion that would not allow for the unnecessary decomposition or deterioration of the person's produce. But that is something that we have to build that out and to look and to have a facility so that we can actually handle that component.
And
But yes, we do have chill rooms and freezers and so on, but these are for the normal storage of meat, fruits and vegetables and so on that persons who trade on a daily basis thing. But we would have to have separate facilities to manage this component.
Okay. With respect then to things that are non-perishable, which would really just require to be storage, and I presume that there's a range of things that are non-perishable that people sell. What capacity do you now have, if any?
We don't have that. We don't have any capacity for that within the public market system. As you would appreciate, in terms of if we're going to take an action, what we do, we would close off the particulars, the stall location maybe. But in terms of seizing articles that we would get on if you go in the vending zones, like that too would require storage capacity and storage facilities as well.
Okay. The question then really and truly is that I think you've pretty much answered. You would need to be able to have a sufficiency of time between the passage of this bill and the date that it comes into effect to be able to satisfactorily accommodate those things that may need to be stored as is envisaged by this legislation.
Definitely.
Okay.
In addition to that too, as well, there's also, as I would have mentioned to you as well, there's the human resource aspect of it as well. And in terms of enforcing the legislation and so on. So it's not only the physical structures and so on, but to those human resource aspects, as well as some other aspects in terms of because you're talking about making arrangements with other agencies and so on to help with the managing of these vending zones.
Okay.
But of course, you will need some physical capacity, which will need to be built out, and we will have to work on that angle, on that aspect, so that we can be adequately assured that we will be able to effect the overall control and regulation that the legislation makes provisions for.
Okay. Now, I see Senator Julian Hunt requesting the floor. Senator Hunt. Senator Hunt, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, the floor is yours, sir.
No, sir.
You had requested. Sorry, I thought your hand was up. It is not?
No.
Okay, fine, no problem. Are there any other members of the committee who wish to have the floor? None? Okay, Mr. King, I want to thank you for your time with us and for clearing the air on a few things. Are there any closing comments that you would wish to make?
Just to thank the committee for having the opportunity to clear up some of the issues that might be there. I'm aware that the legislation does not intend to be perfect. No legislation is, but I think that in terms of trying to bring some regulatory framework to a difficult situation that is taking place on the highways and so on, it is absolutely necessary because as a member of the public, I too have some serious concerns with what I see taking place on the roads, and it will be irresponsible not to tackle them or to try to bring some sort of regulation. We may not have 100% compliance or whatever, but the whole objective is to try to bring some sort of order, some sort of regulation to a vexing problem. Because as I say, I am a member of the public. I have children, and he would want that that they should be able to purchase things or to go about their normal business and making purchases in a safe environment, and that it will protect them from harm or from unscrupulous activities and so on. But as I said, you're trying to regulate an aspect of it that is unregulated right now, and we need to do something to at least, formalize it in some way.
Okay. And your comments are noted, and I'm grateful, sir, for your participation and observations. Colleagues, if there are no other requests for the floor, I want to thank Mr. King for his participation. Mr. King, you are now free to leave us. Of course, you can stay if you want to, but you're free to leave us. And where do we have the next witness? Ms. Nichols? Is she physically present? Okay. We will now turn our attention to Ms. Vernell Nichols, President of Barnufo. Can I ask, please, that I have a motion for, in fact, let me not do it that way. Can I, before we just take Ms. Nichols, could we have a brief suspension for 5 minutes, no more? A motion to that effect, please. Yeah, suspend for 5 minutes.
We have a motion for suspension.
Yeah, thank you.
Second.
Okay, colleagues, we're suspended for 5 minutes.